Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fermilab's Family Open House. My name is Lori Hazeltine, and I'll be moderating this event with Maureen Hicks as Dennis Kania presents Fermilab's Bird Monitoring, Guiding Stewardship of the Land. Maureen and I work for the Education Office at Fermilab. Dennis Kania has been birding since the mid-'80s. He wishes that he had started earlier in life, but he has made up for lost time. Just about everything in Dennis's life is bird-related. When not admiring birds in our local preserves or bird monitoring at Fermilab, Dennis organizes trips for friends and travels just about anywhere in the world. Most of his adventures have been in South America. He has also been focusing on Africa and Southeast Asia. Upcoming trips include exploring the Rio Negro in Brazil, Oaxaca, Mexico, and northern Peru. Dennis teaches bird identification classes at the Morton Arboretum and has been doing so since 1997. Dennis loves to teach and share information. His latest efforts involve an education channel on YouTube where he discusses all things bird-related. Check them out. There are over 40 mini tutorials available via the DuPage Birding Club. Dennis has also worked with several agencies to present webinars on some of his favorite topics, including hummingbirds, gardening for nature, crane migration, and workshops on improving birding skills. Dennis will be here to answer some questions after his presentation. We'll have your cameras and voices turned off, but we'll be watching chat, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in chat. One of the moderators will present your questions, and Dennis will address them after the presentation. Now, let's learn about bird monitoring at Fermilab.
Well, hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for attending today. I'm more than happy to talk about the project that we've been working on for the last 35 years at Fermilab. And it's always a lot of fun to share that with people. So let's get started on that. First of all, of course, if we're at Fermilab, we need to say something about neutrinos. I'm sure most of you are aware of the fact that there's a big project being organized now to shoot a beam of neutrinos from Fermilab all the way out to South Dakota. But we decided that as birders, we don't want to be showing up, so we're going to take birding one step further, and we're going to shoot a beam of Canada geese to South Dakota, and we're going to see if we can detect the impact they're having on golf courses and parks in that region. But on a more serious note, a study had been completed and was released in 2019. And here are just headlines that come from some of the major agencies that we have regarding birds in North America. We have the American Bird Conservancy, National Audubon, and then Cornell Lab. And all these are talking about the same study. They're just saying it all a little bit differently. But when you think about the fact that this many birds are leaving our world right now, it's just a terrible thing to be thinking about. Here the American Bird Conservancy is saying that 2.9 billion birds have been lost from the United States and Canada. So I mean that's phenomenal numbers. And as a birder, as we have been birding for 30 plus years, it's been easy for us to recognize that something's been going on and that we are losing a lot of birds. So it comes as no huge surprise to most of us, but it is still staggering when you see that a study has actually revealed this, and they now have hard evidence of this happening. And if you think for a minute that it's not possible for something like this to be happening, consider the fact that in the case of the passenger pigeon, that was a species, just one single species that numbered well over 4 billion birds at one point in time. And once North American colonists started developing a commercial trade for those birds, we actually wiped out that 4+ billion birds in just 4 decades. So we are capable of that kind of level of destruction, sad to say. But let's talk a little bit about what we've been doing here at Fermilab. For every bird species that we find at Fermilab, we do have a bar chart, and that reflects all of the data that's been collected over the last 30 or just about 35 years. Each one of these color bands in this chart actually represents a 5-year survey period. So we are in our 7th, nearing the end of our 7th survey period right now. And so, as I said, there's one of these charts for every single species. Well, there's 291 species that have been found at Fermilab. So it's quite phenomenal for a one single site in northeastern Illinois. If we go one step further, from the massive set of charts here, we get down and drill down into actually red-headed woodpecker, I can better explain a little bit what some of this represents and also how we utilize that information. So as I said, each one of these bars represents a 5-year survey period. So the very first survey period, this bottom one here, actually runs from 1987 to 1991. And the most current one, this blue one at the top, would represent 2017 to 2021. Of course, we've lost 1 year because we were not able to get on site much, except for the very beginning of 2020. And so for the rest of the year, we were not on site. But the way you look at this, this doesn't represent abundance, but it does represent occurrence within each quarter of a month. And so each one of these little squares represents a quarter of a month. But you have to consider the fact that this square here represents, that quarter of a month, but it's over a 5-year period. So when you have a block like this one here where there's nothing filled in, that means that for 5 years in a row, we were not able to find that species at Fermilab. That's quite significant, especially when you look at the case of a red-headed woodpecker. You can see in the early survey periods, we were able to find that bird without much difficulty. And now, as we've gotten closer to current times, you can see that there's all sorts of gaps in here. So that means that here at this particular gap, we had 5 attempts in order to get that species somewhere on site, and we were unable to do that. And certainly after the first year of the survey period, if we don't fill in a gap, we're certainly trying very hard the second year and even harder the third year, and so on and so on. So to say that you're missing this species for an entire 5 years is quite significant. So it wasn't until just in 2019 we rediscovered a nesting site at Fermilab for red-headed woodpecker, and so that's what accounts for this long line of blue squares filled in. So we have found that we do have habitats still suitable for red-headed woodpeckers. They are on site again, and hopefully we can continue to do restoration work on savannas, which is their preferred habitat, and we'll be able to get back to the days where we had everything filled in like we see down here. So over the years, and we have some data for every one of our survey periods here, starting with 1987 to 91. In that first 5 years, we actually had 4,200, almost 4,300 significant records. And what I mean by a significant record is that it actually resulted in one of those squares being filled in. And we accounted for 238 species in that first survey period. And so as time has gone on, you can see those numbers have kind of fluctuated up and down, but are more or less trending upwards. We're not done with our current survey, so we hope that we can bounce that number up a little higher than what we see right here, get more than 241 species. So hopefully we do get back on site here in the near future, and we'll be able to work on that further. There's always new discoveries taking place, and it's amazing, even though we've been collecting data for all of these many years, we're still adding birds to the list. And in 2017, we kind of it was kind of a banner year. And in December of that year, we did add northern saw-whet owl. And that was as part of our Christmas count that we were doing. And we didn't actually get to see this bird. It was only heard, but we did record the song of the bird. And so we were able to confirm that it was on site. And a couple others that made entries that year were laughing gull and mountain bluebird. And the mountain bluebird we had was a female, so it looked very much like this, not the bright blue that you would expect. This is a bird that comes from out west, and the laughing gull would be a species more typically found in the more in the Gulf states. Another remarkable find that we had in 2017 was a bird that we didn't find out about until 2018. And I was attending a DuPage Birding Club meeting, and it was members night, and so people were showing images that they had collected over the year. And this one birder, Beth Pector, she said that she shot this picture of whooping cranes flying over Fermilab. So right away my ears perked up, and I asked her if we could get a picture or an image from her, and she supplied that to us, and this is the image right here. And so then we actually had a record for November of 2017 for this species. So that was another addition. And that was number 290 for the site. Then in 2019, we had another discovery, and this one is a Prairie Warbler. And the bird monitoring team was out one Sunday morning, and we ran into a major spring fallout. And what a fallout is you have birds migrating at night. Most of our passerines prefer to migrate at night. And when they run into some kind of weather event or some other occurrence that's going to limit when they can fly, they're going to drop down, and they drop down in huge numbers because they are migrating in huge numbers. Well, we had a fallout that occurred, and ended up we were birding on the east end of the site in the East Lakes region, and there's a small woodlot there, maybe a 2-acre lot, and we had probably 22, 23 different species of warblers in there, and one of them turned out to be a Prairie Warbler, which was a new bird for the site. So that was number 291. In addition to just finding new birds, we're also, working very hard to determine the breeding status of all the birds that do show up during the breeding season at Fermilab. In sandhill cranes, you can see, if we analyze this chart, you can see in the early survey periods, we certainly had them coming in through migration windows here in the springtime, and again, not quite as filled in, but we did have, a lot of movement in the fall as well. And that continued to extend even later and later into the year. And so we now, it's not uncommon to see sandhill cranes all the way through December. But what we started seeing here with this survey period, which is the 2007 to 2011 period, we had birds on site during the breeding season. And that was the start of our hopes that we would actually find them at one point in time, breeding on site. And typically what we would find would be sometime during the breeding season, we would have, a pair of birds walking around. And to me, what that represents is that, these birds probably attempted to nest, whether it was at Fermilab or nearby, and probably that nest failed. Usually when you have the two adults together walking around and they don't have a colt with them, which is what we call the offspring, that's a good indication that they probably have had a failed nest. So it wasn't until the season of, or survey period of 2012 to 2016 that we started seeing them regularly on site all through the breeding season. And so again, nothing confirmed as far as breeding, but we did have them on site. It wasn't until our most recent survey period that we ended up finally on May 24th of 2017, roads and grounds personnel found 2 adult sandhill cranes walking with a colt. So that marked the first time that we ever, successfully had them breed on site. And that bird did get to adult size. We actually monitored it through the whole breeding season. And so that bird did get to the size that it could migrate away with the adults. So that was great news. Since then, we've had other breeding attempts, and we know that at least one other time we've had them get to the point where they had a colt that they were leading around on site. We're not sure, we weren't able to track that one as well, and so we don't know if that one successfully left the area. But we do see more and more cranes hanging around on site in the breeding season, so there are multiple attempts going on, is what it looks like to us, and probably not all of them are successful, but over time we will start to see, probably more successes. An interesting little thing was going on in 2017. One of the efforts that we were making to improve habitat for birds was we wanted to improve shorebird habitat, and the way to do that is to create mud flats on some of our lakes. And our water levels are kind of not very reliable, so you're totally relying on luck in order for mud flats to develop. One thing that we thought we could do to help, in this effort was to get rid of some of the cattails. We had, a couple of the lakes, their edges were just completely covered in cattails, which is not going to work well for the shorebirds. And it is a native species, the cattails are, but they do become very, very invasive, and they do create more or less of a monoculture. So we were making an attempt to experiment with cutting the cattails, and the theory is that if you cut them below water level, you'll actually drown out the cattails. So that's what is represented here. This is a current or a very recent cut, and when you do make the cut, all of that vegetation falls down, and so you end up with this large mat, and the birds just seem to love that. And secondary to that, after all of that does finally go away, then you'll end up with these channels. And by creating all of these channels, what we didn't realize that we were actually creating all these little inlets that are favored by some of these other marshland birds that are really, really hard to come up with. Things like least bittern, common gallinule, and American coot. And so other species as well, like rails, all kind of like this kind of a habitat. And all of a sudden it became very easy to find, all of these species at Fermilab, where in the past, we had great difficulty. So just to give you an idea, here's, charts for those species. So for least bittern, you can see we had, just very sporadic sightings for that species, in all the preceding survey periods. But in our current survey period, you can see that, we're really filling in a large portion, especially once we got to the point of the post-breeding season, and there it was just solid with records. And that's all because of the fact that we opened up these channels, and we were finding individuals that were still all fuzzy like this bird here, and that's an indication that they were actually raised on site. For common gallinule, prior to this current survey period, we only had 3 sightings on site over a 30-year period. So even though these birds do nest in areas adjacent to Fermilab, we just never had them on site. And so with the fact that we made all these cuts in the cattails, we did then get common gallinules on site. And in fact, this is the actual nest where this bird is sitting right here. And this was something that you could actually see from Batavia Road. It was right close to the road. And one of our monitors that works with us, her name is Donna Kubik, and she is actually a Fermilab employee. She's the one that located the nest. An American coot is another species that we've had kind of a checkered past with. You can see that during the breeding season we did have occurrences, but we've never been able to confirm the fact that they were breeding on site, and that happened in 2018. Again, as a result of all those cuts that were made in the cattails. So in the efforts of trying to create one kind of habitat, we actually came up with a solution for something else. And so that was very interesting to find that out. So in the future, when we do have a situation where we have an overgrown area with cattails, we know how we want to approach that now and how maybe we can make it suitable for shorebirds as well as some of these marshland birds. One of the key things that we want to talk about are grassland species. These are birds that are in extreme decline as well. And all of these have been represented at one point or another at Fermilab. Henslow Sparrow, Babalink, Grasshopper Sparrow, Eastern Meadowlark, Upland Sandpiper, and Dickcissel. And our goal is to create habitat that would be suitable for all of these species. So we've been working with the lab's ecologists and coming up with management plans that are suitable for the restoration of the grasslands for these particular species. And all of what I'm talking about on this slide here is also the result of that survey that was, or that study that came out in 2019, and all these numbers correspond to that. So for species like Babalink, Dickcissel, and Henslow Sparrow, based on that data, they were suggesting that there was a 53% reduction in population for all 3 of those, and that accounts for about 720 million birds lost since 1970. Grasshopper populations during that same time have declined probably about 72%. And although Eastern Meadowlarks, not all of their breeding population is in North America, some of it extends down into South America, into places like Colombia and Venezuela, and I've seen them as far south as Ecuador. But 65% of their population is in North America, and so that's the only part that is a part of that study that came out. And based on what they found for North America, 77% of their population is no longer there. So it's quite significant drops in these populations. So since Fermilab does have a lot of open space that would be suitable for grassland restoration, it makes sense that we make that a priority. I'm going to kind of drill down into each one of these species just for a minute, just because each one of them does tell a little different story. In the case of Henslow Sparrow, you can see in the early surveys we had no records whatsoever, and it wasn't until about 2000 that we started getting records on site, and they've continued ever since then. And we do find this bird with regularity on site. What happened in 2000 was that these birds were expanding their range from central Illinois into more northeastern Illinois. And so that increase was happening all across the board in that region. However, you know, Fermilab did play a part in that. And we do continue to see them on site. We do expect that you know, we can improve habitat and maybe increase those populations. So that's what we'll be working on. Babalink is another species that you can see all through all of our survey periods. You know, we did have good luck during the breeding season finding these. And again, this doesn't show abundance. It only shows, you know, time of occurrence. But anecdotally, I can tell you that, you know, in the early survey periods, we've easily found bobolinks as we would drive along the Eola Road section of the site, and there were always bobolinks available. And now you may make a drive along the Eola Road and not necessarily see bobolinks on every single visit. So we know that the numbers are decreasing. We're not, you know, they're decreasing across the entire site, just not on the Eola Road grasslands, but all over the place. So we know that we're seeing a large drop in them, and that's reflected in the fact that we are having gaps here. Now, whether or not those gaps can be filled here in 2021 is yet to be seen. Grasshopper Sparrow, similar situation. You know, early years we had these birds found regularly through the breeding season, and now we're starting to get large gaps, very large gaps, which is alarming. And although we do still find Grasshopper Sparrows on site, we're working much, much harder to find them now. Upland Sandpiper, it's pretty much the opposite situation. We have these birds in the early breeding season survey period. You can see that, you know, we did have these birds during the breeding season, and now we've gotten to the point where they're totally absent from the breeding season. This little couple of blocks here that are filled in, this is post-breeding, so this would be after, you know, they had raised young someplace. This probably did not happen at Fermilab. So these were birds that came in just looking for places to forage after they had completed their breeding cycle. And so they made a short visit here, and that's all we've had in the last 10 years. So this is a bird that probably the only place in DuPage County that they were breeding anymore with any regularity was at Fermilab, and we seem to have lost them here. And I know of some attempts of the species breeding down at Springbrook in southeast, extreme southeast, southwest, I'm sorry, DuPage County. There's probably a couple of places out in Kane County as well. But other than that, this is a bird that's extirpated from our area. And so we don't really, even if we do restore habitat, we're not sure where a viable population exists that could feed into back into Fermilab. So we may have lost this one for good. So this is a map that shows all the various land management units at Fermilab. And what we're going to be focusing on over the next several slides is this area right here. We do have a corridor of grasslands, which amount to about 600 acres. The area up here that we're going to be looking at and doing some research on is about a third of that. In comparison to the grasslands, we also have a lot of prairie, which is this yellow ochre color here. And so there is a lot of prairie on site, but prairie and grasslands are really two different animals. And when I'll show you some pictures, you'll get a feel for just how different they are. And the species that we're talking about are all much more interested in these grassland areas versus the prairie areas. The structure is what they're looking for, and what structure they find in grasslands versus the tall grass prairies is quite different. There's one other area that, as long as I have this land management unit map up here, make note of the fact that there's this kind of salmony color. This is a scrubland area, and we'll be talking about that a little bit down the road as well. And you can see that's very limited on Fermilab. There isn't a lot of that type of habitat. In fact, it's a habitat that's being lost all across Illinois. So it is another crucial habitat that we'll want to consider restoration on. So keep in mind that that is right there. So here's a picture of the Robert Betts Prairie, which is in the center of the ring. So it's restricted to most. People don't get to see this, but this is what it looks like. And you can see there's really a lot of forbs in here, really tall plants growing. The tall grasses aren't quite so obvious in this picture here, but this would all be tall grass prairie. So you're talking about big blue stem and Indian grass. So the structure of this site is quite different than what our grassland birds are looking for. Here is a prairie that you can visit. This is where the Margaret Pearson Interpretive Trail is. So this is just west of the big woods along Pine Street is where there's an entry point to this prairie, and so you can park there and hike some of the trails. But again, you can see lots of forbs in here. Here you do get a sense for all the tall grasses. You can see them coming up into this area here. Really tall forbs, many different species of forbs. It's a great prairie, but not necessarily suitable for our grassland birds. They will utilize this, but they much prefer habitat that looks like this. This is what our grasslands along Eola Road look like. There are still forbs out here, but not anywhere near as dense as what we see in the prairies. And the stature of these grasses is much shorter. It's these are all actually non-native grasses. The grassland birds don't care about that. They don't care what they're crawling around in as much as what the structure is. And I'm sure there is some impact on insect availability and things like that, you know, when you're talking native versus non-native. But still, this is all very suitable and very desirable for our grassland birds. And again, there's like 208 acres that we're working on in the northern section of the Eola Road. And in addition to those non-native grasses, we also have large tree clumps out here, and there is a lot of shrubby material out in these fields, which are all bad news for our grassland species, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But the overall objective is to create, you know, the structure that these grassland birds like, and we'll utilize whatever is available, whether it's European grasses or native grasses. The current management plan that we have is going to be managed over a 6-year period, and we'll be monitoring, you know, all of these areas for both plants and animals during that time. And certainly the bird monitoring team will be keeping a close eye on how bird species are reacting to the restoration efforts, and if necessary, you know, we'll readdress how we're going to do restoration in these areas. So again, here's a close-up. This shows specifically the area we're concentrating on. So we have the North Eola grasslands. This is Batavia Road running here, and then Eola Road, just to give you some feel for where you're at. And so this is the west side of the road, and then east side of the road. And then in this aerial, you can see the same areas. Once again, you can see all these gray areas are actually ag. So adjacent on this side, we have all agriculture. All of these little speckles of dark here that you see here and here, those are the tree clumps. And then solid dark areas are actually little wetlands, little wet pockets that are also within this grassland, which should add actually to the diversity to some extent. So here's our problem with the tree clumps. Every tree clump actually, for a radius of about 70 yards around it, makes that area unsuitable for grassland species. They avoid these areas because it does, when you do have these tree clumps, it introduces another whole suite of predators that they're not used to dealing with, things like raccoons. Typically, grassland species of birds are not familiar with those kind of predators, so that becomes an issue for them, and so they are reluctant to nest near those tree clumps. So in essence, even though we were talking about the fact that we had over 200 acres of grasslands here, you can see because of these tree clumps, we're actually down to about a third of the area now that's actually still suitable for grassland species. So one of the things that we wanted to attack right away was to get rid of those large tree clumps. And Fermilab Natural Areas was able to acquire a grant from the DuPage Foundation for $12,000, and all that money went towards eliminating some of these tree clumps. You can see this is what we're dealing with here. Here's one of the tree clumps here. Here's in the process of dismantling that. You can see all the trees have come down already, and they're now, you know, cutting and shipping them and hauling that away. And what you're left with is nice open grassland here. So we're reclaiming large swaths of this grassland that were previously unsuitable because of the tree clumps. So here's a map that shows where our targeted tree clumps are. We've already eliminated number 1 and number 2 here. And so the next ones to eliminate would be one of these three areas up in the northern part here. And so eventually, once we establish some successes in these areas and figure out exactly how we want to do our restoration, we do have all of this large area that we can work on as well. Again, tree clumps down here, so we'll be working on eliminating that as well. But even with removing the tree clumps, we do have a lot of brush in here. This area has not been managed for quite a while because of resource issues. So there are a lot of shrubby areas in here. You can see this all through here. Again, that's detrimental to our grassland species. So we do need to work on eliminating those. So that's the next level that we need to get rid of. And so once again, FNA received a grant this time from Illinois DNR, and that was for $10,000 along with a $3,000 match. So all of that money went towards herbicide applications, and you can see that here's a crew out, and they're actually spraying all of these shrubs. So that should knock the shrubs out, but you're still left with the skeleton after that has been killed off by the herbicide. And here where they're sparse, that's not a huge problem, but you do get into some areas where they're quite dense. And so all of that stubble creates a problem for our nesting species. So one of the ways we're going to address that, and we're actually running two different approaches to managing these areas. On the east side, we're going to be using a prescribed burn regimen, and on the west side, we're going to be using a mowing regimen, and we're going to see how each of those works out. And they both have somewhat different goals. So here we're actually burning, and we will have a 6-year period that we'll be burning, and this area has been divided into 3 units, and we will burn one of those units each year. So you have a cycle that we'll actually go through 2 times by the time we get to the end of this management plan. And in between, we'll still be continuing to do herbiciding of any shrubs that are still in the area. So here, this represents what the 3 burn units are. You can see 3 of them right here. And in the January of 2020, this unit here was actually burned. It was a good winter. There wasn't a lot of snow on the ground. There wasn't any snow on the ground at the point of the burn. And so this area got burned. This spring, we hope to burn this unit right here, and then the following year we'll be going after this, and then we'll start over again. The reason it's important to not burn it all at one time is that one of the species that we're trying to restore for is the Henslow Sparrow, and one of their nesting requirements is that there's a certain amount of thatch on the ground. So if you burn this entire area, you're losing all of that thatch. Burning is still a very important tool, and if we just burn a third of it, that still leaves this area and this area possibly suitable for the Henslow Sparrows and having enough thatch. And then once we go back to burning and we burn this area is in a mode of recovery and still building up thatch, but this one should have enough thatch to support Henslow Sparrows. And you can imagine how that cycle will continue then. So after that burn was conducted in 2020, you can see all the stubble that's left in here. There's quite a bit of it. And here you can see just how dense that is. So it's going to take multiple burns and certainly applications of herbicide in order to get all this out. And we're going to have to work at this pretty diligently because these areas, did not get a lot of management for a while. And so things have kind of gotten out of hand. So it'll be a while before we actually get to the point where this area will be easier to manage and will more or less manage itself to some extent. So it's going to require a lot of effort, basically, in the early stages. And the more we burn, it's going to prevent not only killing off of what's already there, but it'll prevent other woody materials from taking hold in these areas. So there should be still some kind of a burning regimen as we go forward. And again, as I mentioned, it's on a 3-year rotation for the sake of those Henslow Sparrows. So you don't want to manage an area specifically for one species, but in the case of the Henslow Sparrow, what its habitat preferences are suitable for many other species. So we feel that if we target our restoration efforts for Henslow Sparrow, we're actually restoring for quite a few different species. And the same is true for Grasshopper Sparrow, which we'll be more or less targeting on the west side. And here we'll be using a regimen where we're mowing. And so we have one large mowing area, but what we're going to be doing here is actually mowing strips, not mowing the area entirely. And again, it's on a 6-year cycle. And once again, we're going to be doing herbicide applications in between the mowings. So here's what that area will look like, and you can see all these stripes in here. And so what the game plan is that 1 year we'll be actually mowing all the white strips. And you don't mow it just one time. It's going to have to be mowed 5 or 6 times during the year. And the trick is to figure out what the right sequence of mowing is, so that you're certainly not mowing. Our last spring mow has to be completed before mid-May, and our first post-breeding season mowing has to take place after the first week in August, so that we're avoiding that actual critical nesting season. So again, all these white stripes will be mowed 1 year, and the blue stripes are left alone. Then the following year, we're flipping that, and so there won't be any more mowing in the white areas, but we'll be mowing the blue areas, and again 5 or 6 times during that growing season. You still do have a lot of brush out there, so there will be herbicide applications taking place, and some of our challenges in trying to eliminate this through mowing is to figure out the right mowing heights, and then again the timing, especially the timing of the last mowing of the season, because you don't want to mow it down low and then have not have these plants have enough time to regrow to a certain extent, so that you're not dealing with, you know, a scorched earth looking thing at the end of the growing season. So why we even go and take this approach is because grasshopper sparrows prefer a habitat that has some variance in its structure. So not only are they going to have, now because of the mowing, they'll have very short areas, they'll also have some taller areas. And they utilize, through the breeding season, they're utilizing these different areas, you know, some for foraging and then some for nesting. So it's the short grass areas is where they prefer to do their foraging. And so we're supplying them with both, you know, types of requirements. And again, this is one of our more conservative species, and so it's looking for special requirements in order to nest, but those requirements that are beneficial for the grasshopper sparrow would be beneficial for multiple species. So we'll be actually targeting quite a few species that way. Once again, F&A came through, this time with a grant from the Illinois Clean Energy Association, this time for $21,000 plus a $7,000 match. And I'm happy to say that DuPage Birding Club has actually contributed $1,000 to that match. So so F&A is well on their way towards collecting the $7,000 that they need in order to match and in order to get that $21,000. And once again, that money will be going towards targeting you know, woody shrubs out in these grasslands. So if we can eliminate all those tree clusters, if we can eliminate the all the shrubby material that's out there, we'll be well on our way. There'll still be some other issues that we want to address. There are some herbaceous plants out there like tall goldenrod that start to form large colonies, and so I think at some point in time we're probably going to have to address that as well. And ideally, we would like to at some point be able to start converting from non-native grassland to a native grassland, but I think that's pretty far down the road. So as I mentioned, you know, we've talked a lot about the grasslands because it is very important habitat, but then probably another one that we need to discuss would be our scrublands. And when I showed you that, that map earlier, this is the area that we were looking at right here. And so this is a scrubland area. Just to get your bearings, here's Batavia Road running through here. Here's the East Village. And again, here's all those Great Lakes in the East region. Here's that little woodlot, that little 2-acre woodlot where the Prairie Warbler showed up, right in there. But this is the area I want to talk about, and this is all scrublands right now. And you can see it's fairly dense in these areas here, quite dense along here. And so there are some critical species to consider in these areas, those being brown thrasher, Bell's vireo, willow flycatcher, clay-colored sparrow, orchard oriole, and yellow-breasted chat. All of them have bred or attempted to breed on site in these areas, and we're seeing those numbers decrease. We're having a hard time finding yellow-breasted chat now, and clay-colored sparrow has not attempted to nest in this area for a while. So we want to be able to reclaim some of these scrubland areas for those species. This is kind of what it looks like in this area. You can see it's quite overgrown with brush. We do want to have brush in this area, and preferably native species, but there is a lot of buckthorn, honeysuckle, and autumn olive in here. You can see the plants are becoming quite robust, so we need to kind of knock some of those things back. Ideally, what we'd like to have is little islands of brushy material interspersed within native short grasses and forbs. So here's a kind of a close-up of the area, and you can see just how dense it is here and all along here. You can see these are actually, getting to be quite large trees. So the last place that we actually have Bell's vireo utilizing the site is kind of in this area here. So we're going to be looking at this as a model and trying to replicate that as we move away from there and create that kind of habitat. So that's our goal for our scrubland species. Now, just a couple of exciting stories just to share just with some of the great things that are happening at Fermilab. So we're going to talk about ospreys. And in 1980, this is from a 1980 edition of Pearson's Field Guide, you can see what the range map shows for ospreys, and you can see that they kind of in their breeding range they come halfway down through Wisconsin and Michigan. There is a permanent population down here in Florida, but they're restricted almost to just Florida and just barely along the coast. So this is a current map now from Cornell Lab, and you can see that the population in Florida, the permanent resident population, has expanded considerably, and the breeding range here has expanded considerably as well. You can see it's all the way down through Wisconsin and Michigan now, and even touches in the northeast corner of Illinois, and that's where we are. So here's our data for ospreys, and you can see in the early survey periods that we had lots of records during breeding season or during migration, but not during breeding season. So it wasn't until this survey period here, 2007 to 2011, that we started recording them with any regularity during the breeding season. And so the reason for that, first nest that was found in DuPage County after a long period of absence, probably more than 60 years. That nest was found in James Pate Phillips State Park, which is in the far northwest corner of the county, and it's not all that far from Fermilab. And so that pair utilized several nests in that site, starting in the early 2000s. I'm not sure exactly the date that they were first discovered. But here at Fermilab, I can tell you that our first nest was discovered in 2009, and that was this nest right here. And then the Roads and Grounds decided to put up a nesting platform on the east end of the lab, hoping to either have more ospreys or even bald eagles utilize that nest platform. So that was located here. And that nest site was actually claimed by ospreys in the fall of 2012. And then in 2013, in the spring of that year, they did return and attempt to breed there. And then the third nest site, surprisingly close to the first nest site, was established in 2015, and all of these are still active nest sites. There's kind of a little thing going on here with nest number 3 that I'll tell you about. I want to point out the fact that all 3 of these nests are in fact in restricted areas, so they're not accessible to the public. The closest that you might be able to get to see one of the nests would be to come in on Batavia Road, and if you view from this area here along Batavia Road, you can look down the lake and be able to see the nest platform way here in the back. But that would require a spotting scope, so it's not very easy to see any of these birds on site. But here's nest number 1, and you can see it's just on a power pole here. Fortunately, this line was dead, so there was no issue with that. And they've been very successful here. They've raised young every year. We actually had 2 years where they had 4 offspring. In 2014 and in 2017. Each of those years they were extremely successful and raised 4 young. So up until, I don't have data for 2020. I know that they were successful. All 3 nests were successful in 2020, but I don't have the numbers. So these numbers here reflect up to through 2019. But up to that point, so over an 11-year period, these birds just out of this one nest raised 28 young. So that's very significant. Nest number 2, there were a lot of struggles at this site. Here's that platform that was built. You can see the 2 adults here. There's actually a chick in the nest here in this image. They did have that start in the spring of 2013. They were not exactly a well-established pair, and they were not good parents. So they were unsuccessful in nesting for a couple of years, but they did produce offspring in 2015 and 16. 2017, the nest failed for some reason, we're not sure. But in 2018, failed again. This time, we're quite sure that they were attacked by a predator, and we're thinking it might have been bald eagles that went after the nestlings. The pair did return in 2019 and did successfully fledge 3 young. So over a 8-year period, or over a 7-year period, they did successfully raise 8 young. So again, adding to that number. So here's the story with nest number 3. This is where nest number 3 initially was established. So not quite where I showed you on that other map. And since, if you recall my early slide showing the project to shoot neutrinos from Fermilab to South Dakota, the footprint for a large part of that project is right here. And so it was known or recognized that this nest wasn't going to be able to stay here. So after their first nesting attempt in the off season, then we attempted to move that nest from here to this location, just a stone's throw away. And so on a platform here, or on a pole here, a platform was built, and then the nest was actually lifted off of this power pole here and placed on that platform. And in this next spring, we waited to see if they would return. Sure enough, they did, and it seemed like they were going to accept that nest site. But they kept flying back to this pole and eventually abandoned both and disappeared on us for a short time, but we eventually found them setting up a nest on a new pole right here. So they were off to kind of a rocky start, but they did finally, settle down to that spot right there. So they have had some struggles, but finally in 2017, the pair had its first successful breeding attempt, and they fledged 3 young that year. So now over a period of 5 years, they have fledged 7 offspring. So they are now contributing to that number as well. So if you add all of that up, Fermilab is making quite a contribution to the repopulation of ospreys here in northeastern Illinois. So another surprise came up, and this was discovered just a couple of years ago. We found bald eagles nesting at Fermilab, and that's only at that time that was only the second nest known in DuPage County. The other one was all the way down along the Des Plaines Riverway in near Waterfall Glen, I guess. So that would be like extreme southern DuPage County. So this one was actually on the extreme west edge of DuPage County. And it was in a dense woodlot. The nest was actually in a pine tree, and they nested there for 2 years and raised young both years. The first year they had 2 fledglings, and we saw them well late into the season flying around. So those 2 birds successfully fledged and looked quite viable. The next year, only 1 young was produced. That was in 2020, and that bird was not seen well into the fall, so we're not sure if that bird made it or not. And for some reason, they decided to leave their initial nesting site, and they built this new nest. And you can see just how massive this is. This was built just in the fall of 2020, and this picture was probably taken at the end of 2020 or early 2021. But you can see the adult here, and these are big birds. So, I mean, this is a massive nest. But so this will be the 3rd year then that we'll have bald eagles nesting. They are making a huge comeback. Certainly, I think people are aware of the DDT story and how, we lost most of our bald eagles. Well, that same DDT issue, was having an effect on ospreys too. People aren't quite aware of that. But both of these species are making huge comebacks. I'm aware of actually 4 nests in DuPage County now. But our Fermilab one was number 2, and we were just very, very excited to have that added as a breeding species for the site. So over the most recent years, we've added quite a few very interesting breeding species. So we're doing a lot at Fermilab to promote, restoration for birds. As I mentioned, they're all under, great duress. So there's things that you can do as well. Even in your own backyards, you can make an impact. And so some of those things that you might do on your own would be make sure your windows are safe both day and night. That can just be simple adjustments to your windows, and that can save birds' lives. I have a situation here in my house where if I look just to my right here, I'm in my dining room and I have a large open window right here. And then if I look through to my living room to my left, there's another window that, you know, matches right up with that one. So I always make sure that the drapes are drawn on one of those all the time so that they don't see this window and it looks like, you know, a passageway for them. So that's the simplest thing you can do. You can also put up decals on your windows. There's all sorts of different things. And I'm sure if you get online, you can probably find some other ways that you can address, you know, window kills. Keeping cats indoors is a huge one. And you know, that one's a very easy one for you to do. And the studies that I've seen, they estimate that something on the order of 100 million birds are lost in North America to cats every year. So it's not surprising that these numbers that we're seeing from the study, you know, are as significant as they are. I mean, and you have to wonder how many years of that kind of loss can these species sustain. So this is a very, very important one. So if you have a cat and you let it outdoors, please don't do that. Reducing your lawn footprint is a huge thing that you can do. I've converted probably 3/4 of my yard, both front and back, to native plantings now and gotten rid of all my turf. But there's an estimate of 63 million acres of lawn here in the United States. Avoid using pesticides wherever you can. Drinking shade-grown coffee is a big deal. You know, there's many ways to grow coffee. I've birded on sites that are sites that have a canopy over the coffee plants, and so that creates more structure, and it's more beneficial for not only our birds that migrate down there in the wintertime, but also for the native species down there. So it's important. You know, it seems like a small thing, but that can make a big deal. And then plastics, you know, we all have so many different ways that we're using plastics, but what we're not aware of, most people aren't aware, is 91% of plastics are not recycled. So that's a huge, huge scar on our earth. When you see all of these places where plastics are just laying all over the place. I've been to beaches where there's just plastics all over. I've been to different countries where it's just phenomenal, just how trashed roadsides are with plastics and other things that could be recycled. So I've given you a lot to think about here, I think. I appreciate you coming out and attending the webinar today, and hopefully I've given you some bird food for thought. If you do want to learn more about bird-related topics, as we mentioned earlier, the DuPage Birding Club does have an education channel, and it's on YouTube. And if you go to our website here, which is dupagebirding.org, you'll find a link to that education channel. And we're probably over 50 releases out there now. There's new things going out all the time. All of our club meetings are recorded and they're stored out there. And then, like I said, there's probably about 50 mini tutorials as well. And those are released the first and third Wednesday of every month. So that library is still growing. So thanks again. And I'm going to stop my share at this point and we can address any questions that you might have.
Okay, we have a bunch of questions actually.
Okay.
The first one I have is, how much are changes in the ability to find a bird reflected in changes in project staffing?
Well, it's all on a volunteer basis. The monitoring team has been doing this for 35 years now, and it's the same group of fellows that we get together. We bird regularly on Sunday mornings, but then there's also a lot of monitoring that goes on besides that. But it's all volunteer, so it really has nothing to do with any budgeting with Fermilab.
The next question is, are there birds you expect to find moving north and being replaced by other species?
There certainly are changes taking place because of climate change, and birds that typically we would expect to find in southern Illinois are now showing up here at Fermilab. We've had three species in particular that I can think of would be blue grosbeak, summer tanager, and northern mockingbird. All three of those are southern Illinois type species. And we find all of them now up at Fermilab. And we've had mockingbirds have probably attempted to breed on site. For sure, blue grosbeaks have attempted to breed on site. Summer tanagers have not, but they certainly, all three species have been seen attempting to breed in areas around Fermilab as well. And another interesting bird is Carolina wren. That's really a southern species as well, and we're seeing them with much more frequency now. And in fact, it's kind of an oddity that all of our other wrens that show up at in northeastern Illinois and at Fermilab, none of them actually winter here. Winter wren comes down from further north, but they pass through, and they typically don't winter in any numbers. All of our breeding wrens all leave and go further south, things like house wren, marsh wren, and sedge wren. So Carolina wren, oddly, the bird that has moved up here from the south, actually will overwinter, and we do find them throughout the year. And depending on the how severe our winters are, they'll survive up here, and those populations have been growing. It doesn't take much for them to be kind of knocked back a bit, and so we get a real severe winter. You know, their numbers may decrease, but surprisingly, it's a species that's up here all year round now.
Okay, and how does taking the land out of agricultural production affect the habitation of birds?
Well, certainly, if we, in a wonderful world, we'd be able to get rid of a lot of that, and we'd turn it all into grasslands and prairies, and that would be, certainly beneficial, because you're increasing diversity, obviously, by doing that. If you have a soybean field or a corn field, there's no diversity out there. So there are areas that they typically might forage in to some extent. There would be some impact, especially at Fermilab. The ag areas are areas that things like horned larks like to breed in those areas, and they breed very early in the year before those areas get farmed. And there are very few places in DuPage County anymore where farming takes place, and so horned lark is a species that, if not for Fermilab, it would be very difficult to find those species. So ag provides at least for that species. And then also a lot of the money that goes into funding the work of our ecologists at Fermilab, the money that supports that actually comes from the ag. It's supplemented by the fact that we have ag out there, and the money that is earned from that goes towards restoration.
A related question, is the land used as farmland affect the birds that come to Fermilab? Are you aware if they use insecticides, et cetera, that could cause problems for the birds? I
can't speak specifically to what's being done with that, but I know that Fermilab's ecologists, there are contracts that are made with any of the farmers, and so there are stipulations in what kinds of chemicals they can use on site, both for fertilization and for spraying pesticides. So it's something that is looked at, but I don't have specifics on that because I'm not tied closely to that.
Mm-hmm. Fermilab had some really good habitat, and then over the years some of it has diminished. Why is that? What caused those changes?
Well, it's a 6,800 acre site.
Right.
There's only so many hands, and a lot of this work is through the hands of volunteers. So it's not Fermilab's primary goal. Certainly, it is recognized for its ecology, but its main emphasis, its main mission has to do with particle physics. So we do what we can, and what we do is supplemented by the Roads and Grounds Department when they have time available. They assist on many of these things. They certainly help on prescribed burns and things like that. They're also going to be helping with some of those the removal of some of those tree clusters. But it's a huge site. You have to pick your battles. There's only so much that you can do, and everybody that does restoration work faces that. It's not just Fermilab. If you go into the forest preserve districts, both in Kane County and DuPage County, they're picking their battles. There's certain things they can restore, and so based on the data that we provide as bird monitors, that's very useful because it helps give some direction on areas that maybe should become priorities. And so once you establish some priorities, then you can address with your limited resources, you can address the areas that need it the most. I'm being distracted by birds coming to my bird bath over here.
Well, that's a wonderful distraction. I wouldn't mind that at all.
I keep looking over there.
Are there any particular factors you can identify as reasons why there were 4 new bird sightings in 2017?
Nothing specific, it's just the luck of the draw. We actually kind of have a good time trying to, predict what's going to be the next species to show up. I don't know that anybody had laughing gull or mountain bluebird on their radar, but certainly we expected that northern saw-whet owl should have been on site. They probably are on site more than we know, but it's a very secretive, tiny owl, and we obviously are not looking in the right places in order to find them. Certainly in areas that are near Fermilab, they are found periodically. I know that they're found down at Springbrook. I know they're being found at Morton Arboretum. So they do come down. They probably come down in better numbers than we realize, but they're just such a hard species to find. So basically, I can't say why. And then we found nothing new in 2018, and then we did find the one species in 2019, and that was so close to being easily overlooked because its behavior, the way it was behaving, it reminded me of another species that's quite common, and I was the one that found the bird, and I almost overlooked the bird. I could easily have glossed over it, and then all of a sudden I'm a very keen visual birder because I have a severe hearing loss, and so as I walked away from the bird, it clicked in my head that there was something that was not right about the bird. I actually almost walked away from it, and I walked back and said, "No, this is a prairie warbler." So it was just luck of the draw, and we don't know what will be the next thing. I'm putting my money on pileated woodpecker. They're increasing in the county, and both in Kane and DuPage County. I think that'll be the next species that we add to the list.
So do you feel that climate change might be attributing to bringing different species into the area?
Well, certainly.
Like changing the migration patterns?
Certainly, climate change, I don't know if it's changing the patterns of migration, but it certainly has an impact on migration. The migration is initiated. We're talking about birds that are coming from South America and Central America, and so the initiation of their migration is actually based on light sensitivity, and so that has not changed. But the climate is changing, and so when they come up here, and our plants, because of climate change, they're ahead of what the traditional schedule was as far as blooming. And associated with that blooming would be, bursts of insects that are utilizing, the blooms. So the cycle is off as far as when the birds arrive, and the insects have already burst out on the scene and have dispersed, and the flowering oaks have already finished their flowering. So it changes where the birds are going to forage, and they're not going to be as successful potentially in finding food sources because of that. So those two things are out of sync now, and so climate change affects birds in migration that way. I don't know that I've seen a change in how they're migrating. It's hard to determine because, of those 2.9 billion birds that are lost. When I think back to how easy it was to find birds when I first started birding, I thought birding was the easiest thing in the world, and it's gotten a lot harder to find some of these birds.
Well, along those lines, in the decades that there's been this birding project at Fermilab, have any of the birds been sighted that have since gone extinct?
Not extinct. Certainly, as I mentioned, the Upland Sandpiper looks like it's extirpated from our area. So that's a bird that we don't expect. I would be surprised if we ever have a population of them coming back. So that's one for sure. The example I gave you with the horned larks, we're very limited as far as where we can find species like horned larks or Lapland longspurs or snow buntings. In the wintertime, like right now, Fermilab's a great place to look for all of those species because we get these heavy snows. Normally these birds would be foraging out in the ag fields, but then we get the heavy snows which fill up the fields, but the roads are plowed. So all these birds come to the roadsides, and that's an easy way to get snow buntings and Lapland longspurs and horned larks. So it's just a matter of time. Certainly we have Fermilab, but all the rest, if you look around all the rest of the county, just try and find some old country road that you can drive down that isn't a highway anymore. And so it's very difficult to find those birds on site, besides at Fermilab.
Well, I have a whole bunch more questions, but I don't know exactly how much more time we have.
To answer all questions, it's a matter of how much you want to record.
Okay. Another question was, what are your thoughts on bird feeders? Do you feel that it has negative effects on birds, migration, et cetera, or is it more helpful?
It's more helpful. It definitely is more helpful. When the birds first come up, especially in the early spring, and our weather is so switchy, they don't know what they're getting into. The whole name of the game for these birds when they're migrating in the spring is to get up here as fast as they can because they want to get onto breeding territories, because the first one here gets the best territory, right? That makes sense. So these birds are pushing the envelope all the time, and they come up here and they can get caught in a storm or something. And although they can reverse migrate and get out of here, some of them are going to stick around. So if they've got feeders to come to, that's the benefit for them. And we'll see birds that come to feeders that typically through most of the year they don't show up at the feeders. Things like indigo buntings or rose-breasted grosbeaks. You'll find them when they first come up, they utilize the feeders quite a bit. And it's been my experience that a bird feeder setup will never, it'll never keep a bird from migrating. So you might be the life support system for some bird that's trying to migrate, and they won't stick around just for one food source. We just had an example where rufous hummingbirds, it's an unusual species of hummingbird that shows up now in Illinois. They didn't used to, but this is a bird that's changing its migration path. And we just had a couple. One was in Naperville and another one was in Lisle. And the person that was hosting the one in Lisle, she asked me if she should take her feeder in, because there was a lot of discussion about pros and cons. And I told her, don't take the feeder in. It could be the life support. And so that bird stuck around for about 2 weeks. And then one day it really was at the feeder a lot, really refueling, and then all of a sudden it just disappeared and wasn't seen again. So the bird continued its migration to who knows where. I mean, the bird's already off track. It's not supposed to migrate through Illinois.
Well, related to that, are there specific birds that we should focus on feeding? No, not really. Okay. I mean, whatever you want to, whatever keeps you happy. In general, I mentioned during the talk that I've converted much of my yard to native plants. So in addition to feeders, what you can do is you can manage your yard, think outside the box in terms of, what the typical yard looks like. People look at my yard and they kind of scratch their head a little bit, but I've introduced a lot of native plants. There's a lot there for pollinators. There's a lot there for our migrating birds. And I get birds in my yard that I didn't used to see. Part of that might be because of COVID and I'm looking out my window a lot more instead of being out. But, I certainly over the last year, I've seen lots of birds that I don't typically see in my yard. And part of that is because they now have a lot of different places they can forage. They get shelter. I do have a little bird bath out there, even on the coldest days right now. That's what's going out right over there. But, last winter, I would look out my window and all of a sudden, 40, 50 robins would show up in my yard, and they were just in all of my sedge gardens, and they were just flipping leaves all over the place, looking for food. And so, there's a lot of food sources, we don't realize, but by managing our yards differently, and in addition to the feeders, you can just manage your yard differently. Right. What's the difference between desirable scrubland and the area with shrubs that you're trying to eliminate to return the area to grassland?
Isn't that an irony? Believe me, I've thought about that. Well, the predominant plant in our grassland areas is in fact the grasslands. And so traditionally the birds that we have found in those areas before the scrub started taking hold in those areas were the grassland species. So we want to kind of try to restore back to that. I guess we could throw up our arms and try and turn it all into scrubland, but we do recognize the fact that we need to have grasslands for these species. And so we're talking about 600 acres. Could some of that become scrubland? There's a potential, I suppose, for that. The scrubland area has not been managed heavily, again, because of resources. It's not it's anyone's fault or anything. But there's a whole different suite of birds that's critical, in that area. But that's where those birds traditionally hung around. So we're focusing on trying to restore scrublands where scrublands were and where scrubland species were happy. Same thing with the grassland birds. So we're not trying to rebuild something out of, the wrong materials. We're trying to replicate what worked in the past, basically.
Right. So in the burned areas that you have, are you trying to plant native grasses there as well?
That will be something down the road. Right now, we're just trying to see if we can recreate the structure. I know that the Fermilab ecologist would love to see all that become native, because in doing so, you're promoting more for the pollinators, probably. You're increasing insect populations that are more desirable, probably. And, there's a lot of different levels to that would be beneficial. But right now, we're just basically at square one, trying to get rid of the brushy stuff, create the structure that would work, see if we can get the birds in there, and then you could start introducing native grasses. And then it would be a competition thing. It'd be kind of interesting, because you've got our native grasses are warm season, and all of these introduced ones are cool season grasses, so they're growing at different times. So dealing with the competition that evolves from that is kind of a sticky wicket.
Yeah. And how much has COVID reversed the progress that you've been making over the last few years?
Well, we can't get on site, so I mean, restoration is pretty much on hold. Obviously, for things that are contracted, Wally is able to get people in there to do some of the foliar spraying. So that has continued. All the burning that takes place, that's all done with people from on site anyway. So I think there is staff in order to do that. That's not a volunteer thing. So what's lacking is all the stewards that we have on site, that they have their own little corner of Fermilab, and they work on those. Those are all sitting idle right now, and right. 1 year of sitting idle is like you lose 2 years worth of effort. Things start growing out of hand right away.
Okay, it looks like we have time for just one more question.
Okay.
When trimming back trees, should we avoid trimming areas where there are nests in them?
Well, most of the time when you're trimming, you're probably not trimming during the breeding season. I mean, ideally for the tree's sake, you're probably trimming in the fall or in the winter time. If there's a nest on a limb and you need to cut that limb off, you just take the limb, because I mean, if it's not in the middle of the breeding season, the birds typically don't reuse their nests that much. I mean, certainly that bald eagle is, but and the ospreys do. But as far as our passerines, like robins and things like that, they'll build another nest someplace else in a flash. You blink and there will be another nest someplace. They typically don't reuse the exact same site.
Well, thank you so much for this interesting talk. This was fascinating. So thank you so much for your time. Please, everyone who is watching this, go to the Fermilab website. Although Fermilab is closed right now, we have a lot of different activities that are online. You can go to www.fnal.gov. Thank you so much.
No, thanks a lot for having me. I enjoyed talking about Fermilab birding.